From KLCC Studios, this is Oregon on the Record.
I'm Michael Dunn. You've been hearing about climate change for decades. Scientists have warned about the catastrophic impacts that we can expect to see in the future. And while climate change is typically one of the top-ranked concerns of people when polls are taken, it often takes a backseat to worries that are more immediate, like the economy and crime. Part of this is because climate change often feels like something that will happen in the future and not today. But that's not the case. Climate change has already impacted our world, nation, and state, and we're being forced to deal with its impacts right now. Today on Oregon on the Record, you're going to hear from experts who will illustrate how climate change has already changed our state and has already made things worse in terms of public health, the economy, and society in general. Climate change doesn't just belong to the future, but it's our burden today. As we speak, world leaders in Dubai are trying to halt the worst future outcomes of climate change during the COP28 summit. But today, right now, in our state and in our communities, climate change has already altered our environment, our economy, and our lives. Today on Oregon on the Record, we're not going to talk about the theoretical challenges of climate change, but instead talk about what we are already seeing and how our warming environment is already costing us in terms of money, health, and overall community. From climate and social scientists who study the present impacts of burning fossil fuels, to public health experts who must grapple with these impacts, to an economist who sees billions of dollars going up in smoke, climate change isn't a boogeyman waiting for us in the future, but a specter that's already here. First up, we'll talk to an economist who's discovered that climate change has already consumed massive amounts of money that our state will never get back. David Lewis, a natural resource economist at Oregon State University, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you recently published a study. Talk about your findings in this study about wildfire and drought damage throughout the West.
Yeah, we were interested in understanding how markets for natural resources were accounting for the changing risk that has been happening recently by the increasing prevalence of large wildfires across the western U.S. And so what we ended up doing was studying transaction prices that have been observed for timberland across the states of Washington, Oregon, and California, and trying to link those to the wildfire activity that had been occurring just before the transactions had been made and kind of nearby and on those particular forested parcels.
Okay. And what did your study reveal?
Yeah, so it revealed several things. One is, the most important thing is, yes, markets for timberland are definitely accounting for risks from wildfire.
Okay.
The headline finding would be that there's been about, if you take a look at the change in both drought stress and wildfire risk between the last 2 decades of the last century and the first 2 decades of this century, if you take that change, that would add up to about a 10% loss in the value of the average timberland parcel, which, if you add that all up across the millions of acres of private timberland in those 3 states, it totals to about $11 billion in loss.
Wow. And I imagine, looking at your study and obviously wildfires and drought have normal cycles here in the West, but you were able to pinpoint, but because of climate change, these are becoming so much greater and therefore leading to a lot of these economic losses. Is that a general statement that's fair?
That is, yeah. And how we did that is we essentially took some of the results from what's known as climate attribution studies that the natural sciences have done in recent years, where they tried to attribute how much of the wildfires are from climate change and how much are from other factors, how much of drought stress change is from climate change and how much from other factors. So we use those proportions with our damages to kind of break out like how much of that is from climate change. That's right.
Okay. Boy, looking at your findings of what you were able to study, can you then look in the future and say, okay, if climate change, if some of the measurements that we're hearing about climate change, continue unabated, do you have any idea of how bad this already dire projection could get?
Yeah. So I did a different paper that was published last year where we tried to look at future climate impacts. So we use different data for that particular project, but we use similar methods with different data.
Hmm.
And we were trying to look at, like, if you looked out to the year 2050, what would be the damages to Western timberland? And we kind of focused in particular on west of the Cascades, Washington and Oregon in that particular paper. And it was about 40% damage
Wow.
by 2050. So, yeah, I mean, so and the new study on wildfire and drought stress suggests that some of those damages are already happening. And then some of the other studies, like that other one that I just mentioned, was suggest they're likely to increase into the future.
Okay. And, that pretty startling number you talked about, 11.2 billion in damages, does that take into consideration, for example, lost timber harvesting jobs that have been impacted because there are less live timber to be able to harvest? That kind of number as well.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It does not take into account that. Really, where the $11 billion comes from is that looks at the market value of the land itself, right?
I see.
And
Okay.
so that market value of the land itself, which you can think about as the value of the underlying natural resource that sort of underpins the whole timber economy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's really what we kind of look at is we wanted to see, all right, if you take a look at the kind of key piece of natural capital underlying all of that timber economy, what are the damages to that? And so the $11 billion is basically just to the market value of the land itself.
Yeah. And I know your study doesn't do this, but you could layer on, lost wages, you could lost tourism dollars for people visiting forests that may not have the same. So it could be quite stark.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. I would say if you were to think about kind of the total losses that climate change seems to be contributing to forests in general, I mean, our estimate is definitely a lower bound because, first of all, we only do private timberland, not public land, right? And there's a whole other suite of recreational damages and stuff like that are happening with public lands. We don't do any of that. And then all of the kind of downstream effects, like the mill jobs and everything else like that connected to the timber economy, we don't do that either. So we're kind of looking at one kind of really particular slice, and a slice that was, that we could at least quantify. That was the main reason why we studied it.
Sure. During your study process, and then after you obtained your results, were you surprised by any findings? Perhaps the speed with which wildfire and drought has impacted our the forests that you studied, or other kind of surprising findings that you might have looked at?
I think the main thing that struck my co-author Yuhan Wang and I was that most of the damages that we estimate are coming from risks from nearby fires that are not necessarily burning these private timberlands, but are close by. So what's interesting is that the damages we get at are not because, I mean, some of it is because there are some private timberland that's burning itself, and so there's a lost timber on that.
Okay.
But the bulk of the damages that we estimate are actually because these private timberlands are close to these really large wildfires, and that risk that is being signaled from the prevalence of these nearby wildfires is really what's inducing most of the damages.
Interesting. Anytime you talk about climate change and some of the damages that we see or we hear about, we will be seeing into the future, it's such a dire prediction, and I'm wondering, by being an author of a study such as this and looking at this, do you feel that there might be a silver lining in the kind of reporting, the kind of studies that you do, if nothing else, a wake-up call? Or is it in addition to that, is it also the fact that you could say, okay, if we can somehow mitigate the marching pace of climate change, these are the benefits that we can see, somewhat quickly?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think definitely one implication you could take from our study is that they do suggest there are benefits to, slowing climate change at all. I mean, these benefits would come through these, we wouldn't have these damages that we're estimating here. So that's one potential benefit. Mm-hmm. But another thing I'd like to say about that is that I think that, thinking about kind of the dire predictions of this stuff, another thing that I would take away from this is it also suggests that when we think about markets and private activity, so even outside of what government is doing, but kind of just markets themselves, our study indicates that markets are definitely paying attention to climate change damages, and those risks that are happening are being factored into markets. And I think that's important because the prices that emerge from all kinds of markets, and we just study timberland markets here, but there's many others, but the prices that emerge from those markets, one would hope would reflect the risks that underlie them. And if some of that is from climate change, you would hope those prices would reflect it, because changes in prices are what ultimately spur a lot of changes in behavior we see from people. So I think that that's another thing I would take away from this, is that I think markets certainly can help signal information about climate change.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm here as a layperson, if I'm hearing you right, it's like, pocketbook issues always kind of rise to the fore when you're talking about challenges and problems. And so this idea that seeing these direct economic impacts may be, if that can't get action, maybe nothing can.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And I think it's necessary, right? Like, I mean, the prices are interesting in that they signal lots of stuff to the people who are buying and selling these things, right? And I mean, in this case, they are signaling a risk, right, to anyone who wants to buy or sell timberland. They're signaling, an underlying risk that is embedded in owning that type of natural resource. And I think, that's really important to allocating, how we adapt to climate change in the future, as well as, signaling the types of benefits that we could get if we could somehow slow down climate change, make a headway into that really thorny problem.
Indeed, indeed. Well, David Lewis, a natural resource economist at Oregon State University, really appreciate you coming on and talking with us.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
I'm Michael Dunn, and you're listening to Oregon on the Record from KLCC and our show about real-time impact of climate change on our state. The National Climate Assessment is a lengthy report on how our nation is being impacted by climate change. Within that report is a comprehensive account of how we're being affected right here in the Pacific Northwest. The next voices you'll hear contributed to that report and will talk to us about how dire things are right now in our region. Elizabeth Marino, Associate Professor at OSU Cascades, and Erica Fleischman, an Oregon State Professor and Director of the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute. Thanks so much to both of you for coming on and chatting.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Both of you had an important role in drafting the 5th National Climate Assessment. Talk to our audience about what that report is and what it says on a global, national, but also local scale of what climate change impacts we're seeing in the Pacific Northwest.
This is Elizabeth. So thank you so much for having us, Michael. The National Climate Assessment is really a document that tries to understand the current impacts and future trends in climate change across the nation. It's really an important document to let decision makers and the general public know what to expect and to be able to make decisions about their lives and the lives of their communities, right? About how to prepare for what will happen in the future and how to contend with what's happening now. There's a lot of information in that document. There were hundreds of scientists that participated. It's hundreds of pages long, but very excitingly, there's also a chapter on the Northwest. And Erica was part of that chapter. It has really important information for our region. And some of the highlights, I think, are that Oregon has warmed on average 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900. We know that some of the biggest changes in the Northwest are declines in snowpack. We know that a greater amount of precipitation is falling as rain rather than snow. And we know that broadly there's going to be less precipitation in the summer. Erica, I don't know if you want to talk more about those climatic changes, and then I can talk a little bit more about our chapter on social systems and justice that really talk about what the impacts of those environmental changes are going to be on communities.
Great. Let's do that.
Yeah. Thanks, Elizabeth. This is Erica. As Elizabeth said, hundreds of scientists contribute to the National Climate Assessment. And this is something that we're not paid additional to do. We're doing this because we think most of us think that it's very important for society to have this information about what's been happening and to be able to plan. Some of the, I think, most salient things about the National Climate Assessment, they come out roughly every 4 years. They're mandated by Congress. The assessments are very upfront about likelihood of various projected changes and about levels of certainty. So it's possible to say this is something that may happen. Scientists are not sure, but we want to put it out there. We want people to know that it's a possibility versus there is 90% certainty, 99% certainty that a particular change is happening. And so there can be a tremendous amount of confidence in terms of taking action to address that particular change.
Okay. Okay. And then Elizabeth, jump in there in terms of, you talked about sort of the societal community impacts.
Yeah. So, Erica's right. One of the things that the National Climate Assessment does is really to give us a clear picture of what we can expect to happen in the climate. But then there are also a number of social scientists on the report that are able to translate those environmental changes into impacts to communities. So, for example, when we think about a greater amount of precipitation falling as rain rather than snow, that has the impact of leading to a greater chance of things like drought, wildfire, and water scarcity.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the impacts that really affect communities. To take that science further, right, to think through the social science of climate change, we can also think about who and where drought, wildfire, and water scarcity will eventually impact. So when I think about the impacts to Oregon, one of the places that I'm concerned about, for example, is the east side of the Cascades. So we know that that we might experience greater chance of wildfire and drought and water scarcity east of the Cascades, but we also know that rural communities are often underserved when we think about hazard mitigation or post-disaster response and recovery. And so all these kind of pieces of the puzzle together can lead us to start to think about how do we protect communities that are most at risk. So communities like farm owners and agricultural workers, right? These are communities that are vulnerable to heat exposure, both in terms of livelihoods and in terms of their lives. So I think that one of the things the National Climate Assessment can do, and one of the great benefits of working with climate scientists like Erica, and myself as a social scientist, is that we start to put this whole picture together about how greenhouse gases affect the climate, how the climate affects ecological landscapes, how those ecological landscapes can create harm to communities, and then who's most vulnerable. And that whole picture is really important as we as a state and a region and a nation, try to think about how we adapt to and mitigate for climate change.
What are some of the changes that, we might have thought about was going to happen 20 or 30 years ago, and it's happening now? Erica, if maybe you want to jump in terms of, we sometimes talk about the fact that Oregon seems to have now 5 seasons: spring, summer, winter, fall, fire. Talk about some of those things that we, because of climate change or the best science in terms of making those statements, that we have to contend with right now.
Yeah, all of those things. And we also have a pretty clear idea of how things may change in the future. So as Elizabeth noted, Oregon's temperature has increased more than 2 degrees over the last century. We know that droughts are becoming more frequent, they're becoming longer, and they're becoming more intense. Part of that is because of changes in precipitation, but part of that is because of changes in temperature. Even if the total amount of precipitation stays the same or even increases a bit, as Elizabeth noted, we're seeing more, in a relative sense, more rain than snow. And water storage capacity in terms of the snowpack, in terms of glaciers, we're losing some of that storage capacity. So we see that happening now. We see a change in conditions, more frequent conditions under which, if there is an ignition source, that ignition source is more likely to turn into a fast spreading wildfire. And I would say that in much of the Pacific Northwest, as through much of the Western United States, fire season is throughout the year now. There's not a particular season, it's year round. It's possible at any time of the year. We also know what may happen in the future as far as intensification of some of those conditions. And as Elizabeth noted, we see the effects on ecosystems and we see the effects on human systems. I think something else that the National Climate Assessment was very effective in doing is recognizing that all of these systems, as Elizabeth mentioned, are connected, and also the effects of climate change in any particular region of the country affect what's going on in other parts of the country and affect what's going on worldwide and vice versa. So, for example, there are an increasing number of people in other countries who have been displaced by climate change that are looking to migrate to the United States. We see migration patterns, short-term or long-term, within the United States as people are displaced by floods, by droughts, by wildfires. Those can either be short-term events, so think about a major flood where people are displaced from their homes, whether temporarily or permanently, or it could be that a particular type of agricultural system is less viable than it used to be. And so people need to look for livelihood opportunities elsewhere.
And this is Elizabeth.
Yeah, go ahead.
I also just want to add something to what Erica said, which is so well put. But in the ramifications of the changes that she was talking about, like if there's a flood and people are displaced, they're so intricately related to our social systems. So another thing that's really important to note, and this is really, like you said, can get people to think about how climate is affecting their lives right now. Disasters very often also lead to gentrification and land grabs, right? So where I live in Bend, long-term residents are already getting priced out of the housing market. What are we going to do when and if insurance rates go up? So people that are being displaced from the coast, for example, they're being displaced because of big hurricanes and floods. They're also being displaced by the rising cost of insurance. So when we think about the way climate interacts with social systems, those interactions are so complex and they have so many far-reaching implications. And it really is important for scientists to map out all of those processes so we can make strategic interventions to make sure that climate doesn't also exacerbate injustice and inequity.
Well, and I can imagine, and Elizabeth, I want to jump off on this. I mean, right now, the Pacific Northwest might be, and again, stop me if I'm wrong, but might be a little bit better in terms of heating and precipitation compared to like the American Southwest. And so I'm wondering, it could be that people in Tucson and Phoenix, Arizona are saying, enough, I'm going to move to a place like Oregon or Washington. And then that creates this massive problem where you have people who don't have a lot of resources, might be kind of stuck. And this idea of climate migration could really impact the people who can least afford to move or have the resources to protect themselves. Is that a fair kind of an outlook?
Yeah, I studied climate migration. I have for the last 20 years. And what we know about climate-driven migration is that it's very complex.
Okay.
So it's very rare that it's very rare that a single disaster to date, it's very rare that a single disaster will significantly change the population of a city.
Okay.
But we do know that certain populations are displaced in those events and other populations are not. Those demographic changes are just really complicated. And they interact again with things like the availability of rental properties, insurance rates, whether or not people have family in other places that they can migrate to. But we do know, as Erica very rightly pointed out, that when we think about climate impacts, we can't just think about them locally, that we are part of these regional, national, and global systems where we'll feel the reverberation of changes no matter where it happens. And I just want to say, and it's funny because just because of where I'm sitting.
Sure.
When we think about the Pacific Northwest, of course, we think about that rainy Douglas fir, beautiful conifer forest environment. But there's a huge portion of the state that's a desert,
Yeah.
And so it's just really critical to keep on our minds the fact that, if we think about climate change in Oregon, we have to consider Eastern Oregon. We can't separate that part of the state from our minds, and because it's a place where some of these impacts are going to be felt really acutely, both because of the ecological changes themselves, but also because of the rural populations that live there and the sometimes lack of services that can be provided in those places. And so, I just want to remind the audience that we know that the larger population lives on your side of the Cascades, but there's a lot of people on my side of the Cascades, and we might have different needs.
I'm Michael Dunn, and you're listening to Oregon on the Record on KLCC and our show about the real-time impacts of climate change. I'm Michael Dunn, host of KLCC's Oregon on the Record, and we're talking with Elizabeth Marino and Erica Fleischman, professors at Oregon State University, in our conversation about climate change. Elizabeth, I know you're not a psychologist or psychiatrist, but I do want to kind of ask you from a societal perspective, is climate change, is it almost too big for a society to grasp and too maybe slow moving, although I know it's fast moving for you who study it, to really kind of, I don't know, get their arms around and act? Is that one of the reasons why it might be, the problems that we have in terms of, governments and industry doing the right thing and reacting in time, because it's such a, kind of a massive undertaking. It's obviously, it's not called, it wasn't called, local warming or state warming. It's called global warming. And obviously it's enormous. And does that in and of itself, and plus the fact that, on a day-to-day basis, maybe you're not seeing the impacts right away, that it's kind of easy to, pardon the, inarticulate, cliche, kick the can down the road a little bit?
I think the answer to that is yes and no. So one thing that we know in the social sciences, including psychology, is that people are quite different and they're having very different responses to climate change.
Okay.
Right? Some people are taking direct action, are taking steps to decrease their carbon footprints and to increase their adaptive capacity. Some communities are doing that. There's a lot of really good and interesting research being done by Indigenous scholars and by allies partnering with Indigenous scholars that are looking at the way Indigenous communities are responding to climate change. And it's so impressive, right? It's a different strategy and different human environmental relationship that exists that is framing those conversations and allowing for really novel, interesting, and profound steps that communities are taking to respond to climate change. So people are different.
Okay.
And the values and solutions to climate change that arise in rural Oregon or among tribes or in Portland and Seattle, these are going to be different. And as a social scientist, one of the things that I really have seen in the data is that when communities prioritize and protect the things that they love, those things that they're willing to go to the mat for,
Sure.
that it puts them in a better place,
Okay.
right? That following the value sets that people hold themselves and in community, that allows them to make the changes that are necessary to really reestablish, their connection to their local environment and in the process contribute to solutions to climate change. And another way to say that is to think about how we develop cross-cultural solutions to climate change. And this can look like listening to racialized, frontline, and rural communities. It can mean remembering that there are some places where things are positive. So we have this example in our chapter that talks about Costa Rica, right? This is a place where it looks like people are happy, they're healthy, they live long lives, and they have relatively low emissions. So solving for climate change doesn't necessarily mean sacrificing the good life, right? So solving for climate change it is possible to be an articulation of what it is that you love. And that is really, I think, important to remember. And it doesn't mean that things won't have to change or shift. Those are the things that Erica was talking about, I think. But it can also mean that it's a way to act on your own ethics. And that is a way to live a good life.
Okay. Erica, I'm sure you get to ask this a lot, but just to level set for the audience, could you help us sort of, in a layperson's way, understand the difference between weather and climate? Because I think oftentimes people say, oh, well, we had a really great snow year last year, but that's weather, right? Or we, if a snowstorm blows in and people say, oh, well, everything's fine, but that's an individual. Explain the difference if you could.
Yeah. Weather is short term. Weather is what's happening this week or next week. Climate is the aggregate of weather over a long period of time. So a lot of people refer to climate as the statistics of weather, the longer term patterns.
Okay. Boy, and I'm going to ask this for both of you, let's talk short term, maybe in the next 1 year to 3 years. What are the things that concern you the most about climate change impacts here in the Pacific Northwest And then once you answer that, I'm going to ask you, what are the things that you're most optimistic about? We'll go sort of negative to positive. So, Elizabeth, let's start with you. What are the things that you're most concerned about in the very near-term future for the entire state, including you in the east of the Cascades?
Yeah, I've mentioned this a couple of times before, but I'm worried about wildfire and drought and water scarcity. And I'm worried about whether or not we have protections in place to protect rural communities and underserved communities, both in hazard mitigation, so mitigating for wildfires, and in post-disaster response and recovery.
Okay.
So making sure that communities are made whole again after these disasters occur. I'm going to be watching to see whether there's just sufficient support for these kinds of communities after a wildfire or after extensive drought. I'm worried about farm workers and farm owners. I'm also worried in urban environments about heat waves. So this is in the Northwest chapter also of the National Climate Assessment, but redlining created segregation of minoritized communities. And in some cases, those redlined communities can be up to 13 degrees warmer than the average surface temperature of the city.
Wow.
So I'm worried about how we'll serve these communities in the short and long term. The things I'm hopeful about, do you want me to go to Erica now, or can I tell you also?
You can do that. Go ahead.
Okay. Things I'm hopeful about is that we know some of the answers, right? In that example that I just gave of where there can be heat waves and these heat indexes that are much experienced at a much higher rate in redlined communities. We know solutions to some of those problems. We know that green infrastructure works, and we know that there are ways to keep green infrastructure from leading to gentrification, right? So we don't want to put a solution in place and then have that solution benefit others. But we know how to do that. There are social solutions to some of those problems. It's also very hopeful that greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. have gone down, and they've gone down despite the fact that the population and economy have grown. So there are ways to grow smarter. I think that's really important. And I think there are ways to, improve efficiencies in supply chains. There's ways to think about new materials that we can use that can decrease our carbon footprint. But also, again, the thing that makes me the most hopeful is that I think the conversation around climate change itself is changing, that this is no longer the politically divisive issue it has been in the past, that communities that know the landscape, right? And this definitely includes rural communities, that they see changes. And that I think that if we can really expand, sometimes I call it the inventory of possibility, right? If we can think about including all of those ideas and solutions and place-based wisdom that people have where they live, that we can create solutions forward that are that will work and that will make sense within the cultural embedded lives that people live. And that's the place that I feel most hopeful.
Great. What about you, Erica? Both what scares you about the next couple of years, but then also what gives you optimism?
Yeah, what scares me, following up on one of the things Elizabeth said, I don't think that climate change is extraordinarily political at the local level or at the community level. It's still quite political at the state level in Oregon and at the national level. And it concerns me that because it's seen rightly or incorrectly as a divisive issue, when it comes time to compromise within Oregon, for example, of thinking about how can all legislators be kept around the same table to make positive progress for the state, that climate change may not be on that table in the near term, in the very near term. That's not, I don't mean that to be a political statement in terms of what should happen, but it's just the reality that there are certain issues that the governor has said probably won't be feasible to address during the coming year or two.
Okay.
So I'm concerned about that climate change still at the state level and the national level is treated as a political issue, and it's not a political issue. I am optimistic about a number of things. I'm optimistic about what is happening at a number of local levels. I'm optimistic that Oregon has been one of the leaders in implementing regulations that protect workers, that affect some of the populations that are disproportionately exposed to or affected by climate change. I am optimistic because a number of efforts at the state level that are not quite as political. So, for example, the state's natural hazard mitigation upgrade, which is not a political activity, that will address, in part, potential foreseeable effects of climate change on natural hazards throughout the state. So, for example, floods becoming more extreme in coastal areas, wildfires becoming more numerous and larger. I'm also optimistic that Oregon can see what's happening elsewhere in the country and think about what is going to work best for Oregon. So, as Elizabeth discussed, for example, we see what's happening with fire insurance in California. We see what's happening with flood insurance in the southeastern United States. Those types of hazards are increasing in Oregon, and those types of insurance responses are starting to happen in Oregon. But we can see what's happening elsewhere, and we can think about what are some of the responses that are most effective given the way that our state operates and the way that what's most effective for diverse populations throughout our state.
Great, great. Well, Elizabeth Marino, Associate Professor at OSU Cascades, and also the Director of the Laboratory of the American Conversation, and Erica Fleischman, Oregon State Professor and Director of the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute. Thank you both so much for talking with us.
Thank you
so much, Michael. It was a pleasure.
I'm Michael Dunn, and you're listening to Oregon on the Record and our show about the real-time impacts of climate change. Our final guest is with the Oregon Health Authority, and she'll tell you how climate change is already putting us at risk. Julie Cifuentes, Climate and Health Lead for Oregon Health Authority's Environmental Public Health Section. Thanks so much for talking with us.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. So as climate change impacts our environment right now, what are some of the public health challenges that we see today for communities, for people here in Oregon?
Yeah, so climate change is directly affecting the public health of Oregonians in many ways. We're seeing in the data, as well as hearing from our community partners, that heat, wildfire smoke, drought, and mental health are having the biggest impacts in terms of public health.
So who's most at risk?
Generally speaking, our communities of color, rural, lower income communities, and tribes who really disproportionately experience health inequities are the communities that generally are being impacted more. Mm-hmm. That said, if we're talking about, let's say about extreme heat, we could even get a little bit more specific. People living in urban areas with less tree canopy, people who are unsheltered, people with chronic health conditions, and outdoor workers, for example. Mm-hmm. So for each, if we're talking about heat or smoke, there might be some groups, even more specific groups that are being affected more.
Sure. And I'm thinking too, probably those with pre-existing health conditions, and then elderly and the young. Is that also kind of, we hear that a lot. I just want to make sure that that's all obviously, part of the at-risk group, if you will.
Absolutely. Yes. In terms of smoke, people with chronic heart and lung diseases are among those who are at higher risk. As well as young children, older adults, and pregnant women. And that relates to heat as well. Pregnant women, extreme heat is being shown to increase risks of adverse birth outcomes for pregnant women. And also in terms of mental health, we're seeing youth being disproportionately impacted by a range of mental health concerns related to climate change. And we were directed by the governor in 2020, Governor Brown, to do a study on the impacts of climate change on youth mental health, and found that youth are experiencing both the direct impacts, from, for example, the massive wildfires, from 2020, Labor Day 2020, well as just this ongoing, increased awareness of those negative effects of climate change.
Sure. Boy, are there specific areas in the state where the real-time impacts of climate change are even worse than maybe other areas?
Well, I think it varies by hazard. I do want to mention that one really big concern that I haven't mentioned so far
Hmm.
is water insecurity.
Hmm.
I think we're all familiar because I think probably we've all been or living in parts of the state that have experienced drought recently. But more specifically, there are about 23% of Oregonians draw from domestic wells or, as a source of their drinking water. Um, and when we look at uh, I believe it was 2022, in Klamath County alone, there were 461 domestic wells that were reported either dry or very slow to recharge,
Hmm.
leaving many homes with no running water.
I want to talk about sort of the way we need to perhaps rethink some things. I'm thinking specifically around heat. As I understand it, obviously, I think many of us are very familiar with when the temperature drops during winter for those most at risk, those exposed to the elements, those without homes and whatnot. We're used to hearing about, oh, well, a certain warming center is opened up for those really cold nights. Do these same centers, do we really need to think, hey, it's July, we need cooling centers, or we need to be able to offer that kind of support? The other thing I'm thinking too, and I heard this, and I heard that, for example, if you're a landlord and you rent, you are subject to state, county, local violations if you don't provide heat for your apartments. But I don't know if that's the same thing with regard to air conditioning. So I'm just generally asking about, I think for many of us, especially here in Oregon, over the intervening decades, we've thought, a real crisis in terms of weather. Oftentimes, you're talking about, cold. And I'm thinking, keep hearing that heat is one of the worst, heat leads to the most fatalities throughout the world. And do we need to kind of, I guess, rethink how we are preparing for heat and how we're offering respite from heat to our communities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point, and there has been there are counties now who are offering, or cities who are offering cooling centers, as you suggested, because right, there are people, a lot of people who don't have access to a home or a place that can stay cool during extreme temperatures. Um, in addition to cooling centers, local churches and libraries may be open to the public
Mm-hmm.
during times of extreme heat. And then I also wanted to mention that there is a new program that OHA has established per the legislature that provides. I'm sorry. Actually, I think I'm thinking about air filtration devices.
Okay.
Sorry about that. But you are correct. I think we need to be. We are starting to think about extreme heat in a similar way as we have with extreme cold temperatures.
Got it. I also wonder too, as the climate warms and as it has already warmed here in our state, does an increase in temperature, does that create a better environment for diseases and viruses? We obviously went through a tremendous pandemic, and I'm not trying to relate, COVID-19 with increased heat, but I'm just wondering, is that one of the byproducts of a warmer environment is that certain diseases have a better chance to exploit?
Right. Well, I am not an expert in communicable disease,
Okay.
but generally speaking, I think the change, including the change and increase in temperatures, just really changes those conditions. And in some cases, it might mean that certain, um, uh, things like ticks, for example, that were not, haven't been a problem in a particular region, become a problem.
Hmm.
So there's definitely some shifting in some of the geographical patterns of communicable diseases.
Okay. I know that this would be a case by case, or I should say, a climate change related activity specific. But are there general things, even a general mindset that you think people ought to be adopting that can lessen their exposure to some of the negative impacts of our warming environment?
Yeah. Well, one thing that our climate health program has been really highlighting is the importance of social resilience. If you think about we have extreme heat, it might be wildfire smoke, or actually, and a lot of sort of lots of different climate related threats and hazards that are a bit unpredictable. It sometimes can be difficult to try to be prepared for everything all at once. And so really strengthening, I think efforts to strengthen those relationships at a neighborhood level is really important. We know that elderly people living by themselves, for example, are more vulnerable to the health effects of extreme heat. So those relationships at the neighborhood level are really important. Being connected to, community-based organizations, being connected to, governmental institutions and the relationships between governmental agencies. All of the stronger these relationships are, kind of the more adaptable and flexible and resilient and responsive that we can be, regardless, right, of what might hit this season, whether it might be a wildfire. I just want to point out there is an example of some efforts around this concept of resiliency, community resilience hubs or networks that are starting to kind of crop up, and the idea there is to really strengthen the social relationships within community members and organizations, so that whether it's a heat wave or maybe it's a cold snap or it's wildfire smoke, there is a place that people can go either for resources, information, or actually physically go to be able to get access to what they need during some kind of climate event.
Okay. Julie, my last question for you is sort of this. Obviously, when you talk climate change, a lot of times, it's a lot of bad news. And so I kind of wanted to end this talk with you about, kind of, is there any good news that you're seeing at OHA, with regard to our state's effort to combat and perhaps reverse some of the climate change impacts that we're already seeing?
Mm-hmm. Yes. One thing that gives me a lot of hope and encouragement for the future, some of the investments that the state of Oregon has made over the last few years to build climate and health resilience. One example is through public health modernization, which directed more than $43 million to community-based organizations, local public health authorities, to address community-identified priorities. And that includes environmental health risks and climate adaptation strategies.
Well, Julie Cifuentes, the climate and health lead for OHA's Environmental Public Health section, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you, Michael.
That's the show for today. The future is a tricky thing to narrow down. Sometimes it just means tomorrow. Other times it means thousands of years from now. In your lifetime, the future of climate change might have started out as a kind of amorphous idea that would happen a long time from when and where you were. But now, it's landed on you and the rest of us like a heavy cloud. Make no mistake, we're living with climate change right now, and as our experts have pointed out, it's impacting almost every sector of our community. Sobering, yes, but also a reality check that hopefully compels more and more of us to act. I want to thank my guests for coming on the show and talking with us. David Lewis, a natural resource economist at Oregon State, Professors Elizabeth Marino and Erica Fleischman, also of OSU, and Julie Cifuentes from OHA. This show, along with all episodes of Oregon on the Record, is available at klcc.org. I'm Michael Dunn, and this has been Oregon on the Record from KLCC.